Hi all, so in this video we will try to understand what is simple interest and compound interest, but before really going into that, let us understand what is interest and why people have to pay an interest. Interest is, you can think of interest as the additional amount over and beyond the borrowed amount that is repaid at the time of repaying the loan, right. While interest is as old as at least 2000 or 3000 years, right, interest in terms of paying loans and EMIs and everything is definitely still very relevant even today. So, let us say I own a certain sum of money. Now I can do a lot of things with it. I can invest it in shares, I can invest it in mutual funds, I can invest it in real estate and eventually get a good return on it, right. Now instead of doing all of that, if I have to lend out the money to you so that you could put it to some use or because you need it, obviously I expect some kind of an economic incentive from this transaction, right. So when I lend you a certain sum of money called the principal, you don't pay me back the original amount itself, you pay something in addition to it called the interest, and whatever you pay me at the end of the period, at the end of the tenure, is called the amount. So those are some of the basic terms of lending and borrowing. The amount that is lent out or the amount that is borrowed is called the principal. The amount of money that you are paying in addition to what you have borrowed or whatever you are receiving when you lend out is called the interest. Principal plus interest, the total amount is usually referred to as amount. This one referred to as P, this one referred to as I, and this one is referred to as A. Now, so how is interest calculated? Interest is usually calculated as a percentage of the principal. So interest by principal into 100 is referred to as the rate of interest. Rate of interest, which is usually referred to by capital R or in some cases even small r, right. So how do we calculate interest? Now rate of interest are usually in terms of 8%, 10%, 12%, 17%, 20% and so on, right. So how do I calculate the interest on a certain principal? Interest for 1 year is nothing but rate of return or rate of interest percentage into the principal, right. Now that is the case for 1 year, right. Let us understand what are simple interest and compound interest. In short, I can think of simple interest as principal remains unchanged, interest keeps adding up each year, which means if I were to borrow some rupees P now, at the end of the year it becomes P plus interest. At the end of 2 years it becomes P plus twice of that interest. The interest amount is the same, it is constant for each of the years. The next year it would be P plus 3A and so on. At the end of n years you ought to pay them back P plus Ni, as opposed to compound interest where my principal changes. And how does the principal change? Principal changes with each passing year. First year it is P, second year the interest of the first year accumulates, it becomes P plus I. Second year my new principal is P plus I, on that my interest is calculated and that is added back again to the principal to calculate principal for the next year and so on. So of the two, which one is costlier? Definitely compound interest. Why? Because here I am not only paying interest for the first year, starting from the first year I am also going to calculate interest on the interest and add it back to the original and make it my new principal, which means where here each year, let us say for suppose I borrow an amount of 100 rupees at 10%, 100 rupees at 10% simple interest as well as 100 rupees at 10% compound interest. Now here how much money do I owe you at the end of 1 year? 10% of 100 is 10 rupees, 100 plus 10 is 110. At the end of the second year, 10 more rupees of interest, I owe you 120. Third year I owe you 130, next year I owe you 140 and so on. Now if the same thing were to be compound interest, at the end of 1 year, right, I owe you 100 plus 10% of 100, 110 rupees. Now the next year, remember 110 is my new principal and therefore I will owe you 10% of 110, which is my interest. 10% of 110 is 11 rupees, 110 plus 11 would be 121. The next year my principal becomes 121 and I owe you 10% of this, which is 12.1. 121 plus 12.1, that would be 133.1, and the next year I will owe you 10% on 133.1 as interest. 133.1 plus 13.31 gives me 146.41 and so on. As you can see, the first year, for the first year, whether it is simple interest or compound interest, as long as the rate of interest is the same, I will have identical scenarios. Starting from the second year, there will be a difference. Here I owed only 120, here I owe 121, 130, 133.1, 140, 146.41. As years pass, the difference between simple interest and compound interest only becomes more stark and the gap widens. So, speaking of simple interest, let's understand a few more things about it. We already know the terms P, which is the principal, A, which is the amount to be repaid at the end of T years, T, which is the time duration, it can be years, it can be number of months, and R, which is the rate of interest. Now, at the end of 1 year, I owe P plus R% of P. At the end of 2 years, you would owe 2 times R% of P. At the end of 3 years, you owe that person 3 times R% of P, which means at the end of T years, you will owe P plus T times R% of P, which is nothing but P plus PTR by 100, which is nothing but P into 1 plus TR by 100. You can think of this as the amount that you owe someone at the end of T years, where R is the rate percent and P is the principal that you borrowed. Now, my T can be in years where R is in rate percent per annum, but let us say my time period is only 6 months and I want to pay back only pro rata. I want to only pay back the interest for the 6 months, right, in which case my equation becomes 1 plus, now T becomes half an year into R by 100, that is all. And if I am talking about 10 years, T becomes 10, if I am talking about 20 years, T becomes 20, and so on. So, let us look at this question. Ram borrows 10,000 rupees at 10% per annum for 7 years at simple interest. How much money will he pay additionally as interest at the end of 7 years? We know that I is PTR by 100, and therefore I have the principal being 10,000, time being 7 years, and R being 10%, therefore that would be 10 by 100, and the amount paid by Ram at the end of the year, 7 years, is 7,000 rupees. Now, alternately, I can also look at it in this different way. 10% per annum, which means for every 100 rupees borrowed per year, you will be paying back 10 rupees, which means at the end of 7 years, you will be paying back 70 rupees out of every 100 rupees, which is nothing but 70% of that amount you are paying back. Of 10,000, 70% would merely be 7,000. So, I can actually answer the same question orally. First year I will pay 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, that would be 70%. 70% of 10,000 would be 7,000, and that is my answer directly. Let us look at a variant of the same question. Ram borrows 10,000 at 10% per annum for 7 years at simple interest. How much money will he pay additionally as interest if there was a change in the terms and the interest rate was doubled from the 4th year? That is to say, for the first 3 years, right, for the first 3 years rate of interest was 10%, and for the next 4 years rate of interest was 20% per annum, which means for the first 3 years I will be paying 10, 10, 10, 30% as interest, and for the next 4 years I will be paying 20, 20, 20, 20, which is 80% as interest, which means altogether I will be paying 110% as interest itself. 110% of 10,000 would be 11,000. I will be paying 11,000 as interest, and the original amount is 10,000. 10,000 plus 11,000, I will be paying back altogether 21,000 rupees as the amount at the end of 7 years. Or if you are looking for only the interest, I am going to pay 11,000 rupees as interest. So, let us look at this question. If an amount lent at simple interest doubled in 8 years, what fraction of the borrowed amount will have to be paid at the end of the 3rd year as interest? That is, if I plan to close my loan in the 3rd year itself, by the end of the 3rd year, that is to mean. So, in 8 years, my loan amount doubles. What does it mean? P is the amount that I borrowed, the principal doubles in 8 years, which means P becomes 2P, which means to the P that I borrowed, I am adding P as interest, and that happens in 8 years. Now, what is the meaning of that? Each year I am happening to add P by 8, P by 8, P by 8 as the interest each year. P by 8 or 1/8 of P is nothing but 12.5%, which means 12.5% is the rate of interest that I am paying or I am being charged per year. Now, the question is, what fraction of the borrowed amount will have to be paid at the end of the third year? Each year I am paying 1/8. At the end of 3 years, I will be paying 3/8. Now, to answer the question, what fraction of the borrowed amount will have to be paid? 3/8 of the borrowed amount or 3/8 of the principal will have to be paid at the end of the third year as interest. Now, let us look at an installments based question in simple interest. What annual installments will discharge an amount of rupees 1815 due in 3 years at 10% simple interest? First, let us try to understand the question. What does this phrase say? An amount of 1815 due in 3 years, which means I borrowed a certain amount, right, 0, 1, 2, 3, and at the end of the 3 years the amount that is due is 1815 rupees. And what should be my installments? I1, I2, I3. Normally all of them are taken to be equal. I1 is equal to I2 is equal to I3 because he is not talking about unequal installments. In such a case I can't solve the question at all. So, the question is, I borrowed a certain amount, a certain principal, and it amounts to 1815 rupees at the end of 3 years, and the rate of interest is 10%. Now, the question is, how much interest can I pay at the end of the first year and the second year and the third year, so that I can discharge this loan? So, let us see. Now, I am not really interested in calculating the principal because the principal has nothing to do with my interest, not in a direct manner. Now, this is when I borrow the loan at time t equal to 0, year 1, end of year 1, end of year 2, end of year 3. Now, the first installment that I pay would be at the end of year 1, the second installment that I pay would be at the end of year 2, the third installment I pay would be at the end of year 3, and the idea is by paying these 3 installments, I will be discharging my loan or simply closing my loan. Now, look at the question this way. Objectively, I borrowed an amount and I promised you to pay 1815 rupees here, right? Now, if I am paying you the same money in advance, then you should give me some kind of a concession or a discount. Look at it this way. Someone tells you, you owe me, this is the amount that you owe me 1 year from now, but you can also pay it to me tomorrow. Now, is there any incentive really for me to pay that amount tomorrow and discharge the loan? No, not really, right? I would look at holding on to that money for as long as I can, delay it for 1 year and make the payment next year. But what if he says, I will give you a 10% rebate or a 10% discount should you pay it tomorrow, in which case I am likely to consider that option. Maybe he says, I will give you a 20% rebate, chances are I would actually take the deal and then make the payment within the next 1 week. So, something similar to that is happening here. I owe you 1815, but that would be 3 years from today. Now, if you want me to pay this I rupees in advance, you need to pay me interest for whatever I am going to pay you in advance. For example, see, our due date is at Y3 at the end of Y3, but I am paying it to you at the end of Y1 itself, which means I am paying you my amount 2 years in advance, which means on this I that I pay you, you should give me interest for 2 years, which is P into 1 plus TR, which is P into 1 plus 2R by 100. Similarly, on this second I that I am paying this at the end of Y2 when I could have paid at the end of Y3. On this I, you give me 1 year's interest. And as for this last I, on the very day I make the payment, I am closing my loan. Therefore, I do not deserve any interest on that, but yes, I am paying the actual amount. First amount that I pay and interest on the first amount, second amount that I pay, second installment and the interest on the second installment, and the third installment I pay should be equal to 1815 rupees. I know R is 10 by 100, I into 1 plus 1.2 plus I into 1.1 plus I is equal to 1815. I into 1.2 plus 1.1 is 2.3, 2.3 plus 1 is 3.3 is equal to 1815. Therefore, I is 1815 by 3.3, 1.1605, which is 550 rupees, which means if I were to pay 3 installments of rupees 550 each at the end of 3 years, I can actually discharge my loan completely.